Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
you are audible.
Great, perfect. Now we have that out of the way, we can start. Starting my speech in three, two, one. First, a bit of framing on what this is likely to look like. This is likely to look like multinational development banks requiring things such as clearly displayed finances on all projects. These MDBs gaining access to all accounts and transactions made about these specific projects. Thorough checking on all the corruption indexes, especially for people who were previously associated with corruption, especially for individuals who might be problematic within the finances, checking who is getting paid, what they're getting paid from, and are services promptly delivered. This will, to some extent, slow down the effectiveness of natural resource extraction, but it is likely to be thorough, as World Bank and other MDBs are likely to require this because they want their money to be be spent well, as the financiers who fund these multinational development banks want their money to be used effectively, and if not, they're willing to withdraw their funding. It also probably means like the personal finances of all included individuals who have access to the money given by the multinational development bank are also probably going to be checked and thoroughly passed to the to the MDBs themselves. Right, insight into who makes decisions, insight into how contractors are chosen, proof of fair and unbiased contracting. Cool. Unlike commercial banks, multinational development banks do not seek to maximize profits for their shareholders. Instead, they prioritize development goals such as ending extreme poverty and reducing economic inequality, right? They often lend to at low or no interest rates or provide grants to fund projects in infrastructure, energy, education, things like that, right? Before that, CEO, please, what's your question?
Yeah, I just need to confirm who's going to be the one doing the checking, or is this going to be self-reported?
Right, so multinational development banks set up a set system of criteria what specifically needs to be given up and what needs to be proven and given as evidence to make sure that this is effective. If they believe that there is evidence of tampering, they probably have the ability to go and check themselves or to have independent bodies who do this checking, but probably to some extent it's self-reported unless you see any proof that it's likely that there's problematic. But probably it's probably a robust set of rules on what you specifically need to prove and what papers you need to have and what pictures you need to send to make sure that this is actually done in a fair, balanced way. Cool. Note, this is because MDBs give it low or no interest rates. It's the best loan a country could get. No alternatives could ever match this. This is why you can caveat conditions because countries want these low interest loans, right? 3 or 4 primary points that are going to come out here. No, 3. 1 on preventing mismanaging of funds, 2 on preventing ecological disaster, and 3 on promoting future FDI. On the preventing of mismanaging funds. Also, can somebody post my time in the chat? I think my timer is messed up. On preventing mismanaging funds, corruption is the main problem in areas. Thank you. Corruption is the main problem in areas where the World Bank and similar institutions operate, right? These are usually low-income countries who rely primarily on primary industries, e.g., resource extraction, for the majority of their gross domestic product. Corruption indexes in these countries are often high. Funds are often mismanaged. There are often low bureaucratic capabilities, no checks and balances, and a hegemony of problematic corruption in history, right? Because countries rely on resource extraction, the World Bank gives you the money to create the necessary initial payment to be able to effectively extract the resources that you have in your country. You are likely wanting to comply to these things. Note, even if you are a corrupt politician in these places, you probably want to comply with the World Bank's requirements because you want to extract the resources that your country has, because this is the primary way that you're going to better your country. Even if you don't care about bettering your country, you're going to keep the people who elect you happy, or the people who you're corrupt to happy, because you're going to significantly contribute to the country's economy, right? Not complying is also politically unwise, as the party paints itself as potentially corrupt, and it's easy for the opposition parties to be able to use this and saying, look, if you're not complying, you have something to hide, obviously you are corrupt. Meaning you are able to opposition parties are able to weaponize this narrative if they don't comply, meaning parties are politically pressured into compliance to these terms, meaning parties are likely to accept these. And thirdly, countries are competing for a limited amount of multinational development bank funding. If you don't do it, the neighboring country will, because they also probably rely on natural resource extraction for the majority of their BDP. This is where the people who live in the country work. This is what their livelihoods depend on. This is where their jobs are. This is what they think about every day. This is their inherent part of life for them as members of this country. Meaning you are likely to co-opt to this because you want these people to be happy, because these are the people who are going to democratically elect you. Note, the points of impacts here are multiple. one, more resources extracted means financial gain for the country. At the point where you're able to get a larger initial investment at the start, you're able to extract more money for the country and therefore have better lives for the citizens, more jobs and more modernization and better living standards. But secondarily, it also means more future loans and more other MDBs. There are a lot of MDBs that exist in any given place, right? There's like 15-ish. Many MDBs still exist, and they're more likely to invest in you if you follow these principles and have been shown to be a good lender in the past. Secondarily, on preventing ecological disaster. Fund mismanagement can cause ecological disaster, e.g. overpaying consultants or contractors, not ensuring safety measures, storage, pipes, machinery, waste disposal, etc. Right? Ecological harms, they harm the country long term. They prevent future extraction. They harm biodiversity. They prevent future generations from using specific things. They can also harm large groups of people, e.g. poisoning the water if you don't store biological waste well enough, right, and things like that. Meaning at the point where you're giving more checks and balances, you're more likely to make sure that these funds end up in the hands of professionals who are going to use the funds well to complete their jobs dutifully and meaningfully, more and less likely to create ecological disaster and harms to individuals there. And lastly, this is going to promote foreign direct investment outside of this MDB, meaning at the point where you strengthen legal and regulatory certainty, it's more likely that other foreign direct investors are going to want to come to your country and therefore invest. Why is this true? At the point where they know you're getting sufficient economical capital somewhere else that is not them. This capital is primarily being used to create infrastructure. At that point, foreign direct investors believe that there is capability for them to maximize on the profit. They don't have to put down the biggest sum of money, which is the initial investment of things like such as infrastructure, but they can create jobs, they can create factories, and they can therefore make sure that the people who work there are able to profit, are able to use the loans and foreign direct investments that these countries would do. At the point where they believe that there is significant checking done by an outside organization that they trust, an outside organization that other richer countries who care about bureaucracy, who care about sustainability, pay into. At that point, they're more likely to believe that their investment is safe. Only when risks are low enough to justify investments do you get good and efficient, non-predatory foreign direct investors who are able to effectively give money to a country and therefore increase the livelihoods and benefits and create jobs for the vast majority of people in any given country. For these reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for the clarifying speech, calling upon the leader of opposition to begin their side of the case. Here.
Just check that my audio and visible.
Yes, you are.
Here, him, your eyes. At a time when the trust in these financial institutions from third world countries and developing countries are at an all-time low, I don't think the solution is to add more requirements for these countries to follow and perpetuate the perception that the IMF or the World Bank is only applying a Western one-size-fits-all solution. I think the solution is to loosen up these restrictions so that you can actually give the aid to the countries that need it most. A few points of framing. Firstly, I think this debate is primarily about developing and third world countries who do not have political transparency. If not, they would not be subject to the requirements of side government. But second thing here is that I think lack of political transparency isn't in of itself inherently bad. There are many reasons on why statesmen still want to do what's best for their country, right? They're competing with other local countries for influence and power and FDI, as you say. They don't want their people to riot and they want prosperity for the nation. The impact of all this analysis is that there's still an incentive to do good things and to do good things on a global stage. It's just we don't think political transparency is inherently logically prior to those things, and we don't think it's necessary for those things. The other thing to say here is that you can still do bad things with political transparency. Like there are bad laws being passed in Uganda to like criminalize homosexuality or all those bad things, and those things happen not because like some backdoor deals are going on, it is because the country themselves decide to do that. And there are protectionist policies as well that are harming trade that happen as even in the absence of political transparency, right? The example we like to give to you is Singapore. It's not really a strong democracy because it's a one-party dictatorial rule, but it still has very good financial institutions and very good things that get the process done and get decision-making done faster. We also think the worst harm you could give us is probably money embezzlement. We have a few mitigations to this, right? One, institutions like like the IMF and the World Bank, are probably not going to fund outright dictatorial regimes because it's useless anyway, right? These regimes are just going to take the money and use it for their own stuff, and they have a reputation of that. But secondly, these countries have a reputation to maintain, right? So if they take all the IMF money and embezzle it to something else, they will not get IMF money in the future, and their competitors or the country that is next to them will get that money. And considering the fact that most countries oftentimes share natural resources, like a bunch of countries in Africa share like a lithium bed and all those things, they're probably gonna like just give funding to the other country who is more politically transparent. What we prove through here is that there is a natural push for political transparency and a natural push to do things well. We don't think that you need to restrict, you need to apply political transparency laws to that. First argument then, we think it is hard for like developing countries and third world countries to be politically transparent. Because what are the contexts of these countries, right? They are oftentimes post-colonial, they are new democracies or nascent democracies, and they are resource-rich countries in volatile or high conflict areas, like Middle East countries that are sharing a bunch of oil beds that are prone to like sectarian violence and also fighting and infighting, right? I think these countries rarely have strong democracies. Like countries in general rarely have strong democracies in the beginning, right? The reasons for this is that there are conflicting political beliefs, regional power figures are trying to spur dissent, and the population does not have a strong conception of good policies. Even the US, even Malaysia, even Russia has always started out like with a bad democracy. It is because it became richer, and it is because that it just waited it out that these countries were able to evolve its democratic system, and because the quality of life of the people improved, were the people able to push for more democratic change and more democratic accountability. I think those things need to come first before you can push for a strong democracy. So why are countries not politically transparent to begin with? I think one is to maintain stability, right? Oftentimes, political transparency involves like revealing information about where the whereabouts of politicians are, or like the financials the politicians are using. Oftentimes, these things lead to like direct lines of attack that allow the opposition or like sectarian figures within the country to attack you directly and call for the like removal of your government. Secondly, they also want to maintain investor confidence, right? If it is true that these countries are doing bad things and then they publicly release these things, I think investors will be turned off at the outset and not want to invest in these countries. Oftentimes, political transparency or political intransparency is used to signal to people that our country is something as good. This builds off of the model that OG gave us, which is extremely high, right? They say that the banks are going to require all access to banking details, access to politician information and financial accounts. I think the barrier to entry is extremely high because of what OG said. This means that transitioning to the transparency, like political transparency, probably involves revealing what corrupt practices you did. And if you are the leader of the sole party within a country and you have to disclose this information, people are probably going to call for your removal, people are going to call for violence, and people are going to call for you to be overthrown. In the face of that, even if you're able to create a more like accountable like country, you're probably going to have a lot of like division in the country and different views of what is happening. I think the impact of their policy is that funding for these projects end up going to countries who need it the least, the countries who are already politically transparent, because these institutions have a reputation of helping out to maintain. They're going to just go direct funding to countries who don't need the funding because they already have politically strong democracies, and that's what's going to happen inside of it. I think the third thing to say here is that what are the harms of trying to force political transparency? I think one, you give ammo to separatists, and secondly, you encourage division and violence within the country. For that, I'll take a POI from closing.
So if it's true that these nations that you characterize are so corrupt that it takes them a long time to be political transparent, where's the guarantee that they will use these funds effectively?
Okay, I gave you a bunch of mitigations already. These countries want to do good. They're competing with their neighbors. They want to get the FDI and they want to become rich. They just don't want their people to riot. If they cause poverty, then the people are going to riot anyway. They're maintaining a very careful balancing game. And I think if you like disrupt that process on your side, this results in a worse form of democracy. Second argument, I think their side defeats the purpose of what natural resource extraction funding projects are, right? Why do these projects exist? For two reasons. One, resource extraction requires a lot of upfront capitals and oftentimes new and poor countries unable to use like their own resources to pay for these projects, and those financial institutions expect a return of investment down the line when these projects are set up and these countries are extracting all these natural resources, right? But secondly, these institutions also want to maintain leverage over these nations. So if you make the barrier to entry super high, these nations are just not going to default to their normal routine, and I'm not going to accept your funding. I'm going to paint you as bad guys, like African countries continually pay in the IMF, and I'm just going to not opt into you in the first place. This not opt-in is extremely harmful because now you have no leverage over these countries. You can't ask these countries to do anything. Whereas before, you could have given conditional loans and maybe asked some minor changes that are more effective, like requiring like certain other things. Now you can't. Second thing, why you can transition to a transparency in the long term on our side, right? I think there's something that is not exclusive to their side. I think just the time frame which matters. The reason why is that there are natural incentives to be transparent as the country grows and the country expands. 4 reasons. One, quality of life of people increases the moment you become richer, which means these people are able to push for better political change. Secondly, people become more accustomed to the idea of democracy and accustomed to the idea of stability, as insofar as you don't have to worry about putting food on the table, you're going to ask for your politicians to be more accountable to make the things more efficient, right? Thirdly, MNCs, like when they come into the country, naturally call for more transparency. These companies also don't want their natural lives to be disturbed. They're going to call for transparency. Fourth, globalization. As the country becomes more connected and more institutions are set up, power needs to be shared in order for the things to be done effectively. We think this naturally results in all those things. The bottom line here is very hard to push for change when people are poor and starving. It's easier to sow dissent and chaos than it is to ask people to push for more transparent government. I think you disrupt that process on their side, and I think you make it much harder. And I also like to note that they say federal direct investment makes people richer. Our case is logically prior to theirs, because you need to become rich to be transparent to access all their benefits. For all those side with OO.
Thank you so much, Elo, for the clarifying speech, calling upon DPM to extend upon the case here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Well, first of all, I'd like to do the rebuttal to the leader of opposition. They have mentioned the effectiveness of development aid. Well, first of all, while even if there could be short-term delays or challenges in implementing transparency required, the long-term benefit outweigh these concerns. Transparent practices can attract more responsible investors, reducing financial risk, and improve the overall investment climate. And this can lead to more stable economic growth and sustainable development over time, as our Prime Minister mentioned. Moreover, they've also mentioned about the practicality and feasibility. Well, requiring transparency enhance accountability by allowing civil society and local communities to monitor the action of their governments and companies involved in resource extensions. And these fosters greater public trust and participation in decision-making processes, which are crucial for inclusive and sustainable development. Furthermore, they've also mentioned about low trust in MDBs. Well, there's not a significant mistrust into WB. Most low-income countries currently cooperate with them. Not true. Many MDBs have existed no lack of trust. For example, European Investment Bank, Asian Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Inter-American Development Bank, African Development Bank. This banks still have a trustworthy. This will be still trustworthy. And they've also mentioned that they already exist incentivized to not be corrupted to get for future loans. Yes, countries want to have future cooperation, but there exists some politician who only wants to take their money and run. If one does this, they can mess up with the country's reputation for years, lose millions of jobs, irreversibly destroy an environment. These individuals do not care about the future of the country. Well, OG prevents these harms before they happen. OO can only punish the innocent people of the country and after their harms are already done. And OG is trying to prevent those things. No, thank you. And they've also mentioned about if requirements are too hard, they want opt-in. Well, the Prime Minister already gives you multiple reasons why countries will opt-in. If you need to extract resources, you need a lots of money upfront to do it. You need to buy equipment, do lots of scanning, pay lots of people for their work, build roads, etc. If you get this money from MDBs, you can extract a lot more money. Therefore, they are incentivized to accept these loans to be politically popular and to improve the condition of themselves and everyone in their country. Moving on to my argument. So, well, first of all, there be no conflict anymore with the political conflict with the World Bank and any other countries and this organization. Well, the transparent governance ensures that local communities have access to detailed information about natural resource projects, including their scope, potential impacts, and benefits. When communities are well informed, they can actively participate in decision-making process regarding resource extraction projects. This involves reduced feelings of marginalization and foster trust between communities, government, and project proponents. Transparent funding requirements include clear mechanisms for addressing grievances related to the source exploitation, such as environmental concerns, land right disputes, or economic benefits distribution. Clear and accessible information about project benefits and risk help manage community expectation. This transparency reduces misunderstanding that could escalate into conflict, as stakeholders have a holistic understanding of the project's implication. Moreover, transparent funding condition mandate meaningful consultation with and consent from local communities before project commencement. Projects that gain local acceptance through transparent engagement process are less likely to encounter resistance or protest. This reduces disruption to project timelines and operation, minimizing potential conflicts. Transparency supports peace building by encouraging open dialogue and cooperation among all stakeholders, including communities, government, and investors. Informed communities are more inclined to seek peaceful resolutions to dispute over resource extraction, supported by transparent governance framework that facilitate
right.
management and conflict resolution. Transparent funding requirements enforce accountability in the allocation and utilization of resources intended for natural source project. Reduced corruption associated with resource revenue lower the likelihood of conflicts over control of funds and minimize elected activities linked to resource exploration, such as illegal mining or trafficking. A transparent government practices ensure inclusively and responsible management of natural resources, aligning with the SDGs related to the environmental, sustainable, and social equality. Sustainable development practice promoted through transparency help address underlying causes of conflicts, such as inequitable resources distribution and environmental degradation, thereby promoting long-term stability. So our open governance strongly
right.
believes that upset.
Yeah, if being transparent means I as a leader have to disclose corrupt practices I did and probably results in me getting out of power, will I take the funding project that you offer?
Oh, pardon, can you type the POI throughout the chat? So, however, concluding my speech before answering to the POI, we strongly believe that a transparent political work between the World Bank or other organization with the government will only give a beneficial points as a long-term benefit to the government and the organization, moreover going through the whole community of this world. And is a POI on the chat? Oh yes, we believe that you probably still accept the funding project because before there could be corruption practices that could probably result in as this organization or government being transparent to the politician, actual corrupt will decrease, and probably most of the governments would agree with this politician and this project. And moreover, corrupted leader will over time get voted out as leaders who refuse these deals are likely to be crushed by opposition parties. And thank you.
Thank you so much, TPM, for the clarifying speech following upon the leader of opposition, DLO, to begin their celebratory speech.
All right, just give me a few minutes to set up my timer. Am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Forcing strategies in is never the answer, especially if developing nations physically cannot comply with them. I think you only hurt them on government bench. Because I want to know that if developing countries had the capacity to be transparent, I think they would do it anyway in status quo, because obviously it will lead to like just more legitimacy on the international stage, and they already receive the benefits of being more transparent. So this debate takes place when countries do not currently have frameworks and institutions to comply with the political transparency regulations. Secondly, I want to flag and note that most of the corruption doesn't happen when you're managing your finances. It happens in other ways like undemocratic processes and just stuff like that. But the structural reason why this is likely to occur is that leaders aren't dumb, right? They are unlikely to just line their own pockets when they receive funding because they know if they don't show effective results, clearly something fishy is going on, and the World Bank can literally see this. If you're supposed to extract 10 million like pounds of coal or whatever, and you only extract 8, clearly something is going wrong, and then you won't receive any more money in the future, and your funding will be cut off, and this will just screw your future of the country in the long term. The nuance that, insofar as the World Bank will no longer give you money, they're likely to give it to another country next to you. And this is a problem for developing countries, because the countries next to you with the same natural resources will flood the market with the same natural resources, and therefore you already lose any competitive advantage right now and for the future. I have a few clashes in this speech. Firstly, if transparency is the most important issue right now, and secondly, on which side is better help developing countries in the future. So first clash then, is transparency the most important issue? Because I want to know the strategic misfall of OG. Because I'm clear as to why transparency is suddenly the magic bullet to solve all of the developing countries' problems, and it will magically change the decision-making calculus of political leaders. Because we told you that bad laws are always passed even if it's more transparent, right? Because technically now you actually give bad laws more legitimacy because it seems like the political parties followed all the procedures. But secondly, I don't think OG has a PR to say this will suddenly change the decision-making calculus of governments entirely. Because I'm unclear as to why suddenly they're going to hire the right people, they're going to hire and they're going to do things properly to make sure the environment isn't like screwed, right? Because if the government doesn't even believe in prioritizing the environment in the first place, this clearly doesn't happen. Being more politically transparent doesn't change the government's inherent political belief and their political stance. It doesn't make them more liberal. If they were already conservative, they would remain conservative. So this is important because it shows that most of OG's benefits are symmetric at best, and the US is just incorrect at worst. Before I move on to the more contentious clash, I'll take a point.
So multinational development banks are likely to set conditions that are meetable because they also want to give this money out to fulfill their own goals. Even if it wasn't the biggest problem, we are preventing some mismanaging of funds. Your case is at best mitigatory.
I think the current regulations are already kind of hard for people to reach. Therefore, you adding this extra regulation makes it even so much harder, right? So this is why we are literally debating this motion, right? So let's issue then on which side helps the developing countries. I think the main push we get here from government is that this forces developing countries to become more transparent, and this is just a net good, right? But I think perhaps OG proves incentive, but I want to note that incentive and capacity is different. They never actually prove the capacity to comply, and this was the whole crux of their case. 4 reasons here why people developing countries cannot comply. I think firstly, we told you that they are often post-colonial or just post-conflict. So this means they are going to suffer from instability. Therefore, their utmost priority right now is collectivize power and to ensure stability and unity. And this is why they already bypass and they don't prioritize transparency. But secondly, they already just have weaker institutions and governing frameworks, right? Because these countries don't have much independent institutions within the country to just keep each other in check in general. But thirdly, political leaders and elites have an active incentive and an active interest in maintaining their power and their economic advantage. Because obviously, if I just go out to the public and say, "Oh, my bad, I did wrong. I was like corrupt in the past." Obviously, this gives ammunition to their opposition parties because they literally admit to their own wrongdoing. You make your population angry, and you're more likely to lead to you getting out of power in the first place. But lastly, just admitting is just giving more ammo to your separatists and to your extremists who don't believe in political transparency, and therefore they're likely to weaponize this to inflame the populace. Therefore, in OG's best case, and if transparency is the most important, I think what we are going to prove instead is that what matters most for developing countries is to get the money now, and that's what we achieve when we don't actually place these restrictions onto them, right? The premise is here, insofar as they get the funding from the World Bank without these restrictions, they're better able to export their natural resources and they will get richer as a nation. So if transparency really is the most important issue, we are going to prove how we get transparency in the long run anyway, right? This is for a few reasons. Firstly, now when you're more when you get funding to extract your natural resources, you're subject to things like sensationalization and globalization because more corporations are coming in and trading with you and extracting these natural resources. So there's already more scrutiny on the current government to do good. But secondly, there's just more public demand for transparency as the country gets richer, right? Because the problems of the local population, their most proximate problems are already solved. So they're no longer worrying about whether they can survive the next day, whether they can get food on the table. But now it is already solved for them. They're going to look for the next thing in the future. So they want to know if that they can actually become represented and if that the democratic processes can actually be respected. But thirdly, when countries are just more richer in general, they can do things like invest in more democratic institutions, right? Like having an independent judicial system, holding fair and free elections, like having a human rights commission, or just like having independent regulatory bodies. So the upshot is that you need to give countries time to get transparency. You can't just force it in because right now they physically do not have the institutions and the capacity to become more politically transparent. So therefore you need funding first. You need to become richer before you can achieve all the benefits that OG claims to be. So why is the so important, right? Because insofar as they can't actually get funding on OG, you lock them out, right? You hurt those developing countries because you limit the extraction of resources, and therefore the developing countries already lose their comparative advantage when their neighboring countries get into the marketplace and they already start extracting the resources. And this is important because these developing countries are often unskilled in other areas. So the extraction of natural resources is the only avenue for empowerment and is the only avenue for potential future development, right? So insofar as we prove that funding is actually a prerequisite for a transition to a more democratic and a more transparent state, I think we can then claim all their benefits as well, like the future funding from other banks that think you are like more transparent. So I think OG was uncomparative in this debate. What's the weighing then? I think we already win this debate because we told you that this was logically prior. Because insofar as you never get the funding on government's bench, you actually aren't able to actually lead to any changes. Because on your side, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because once they can't get the funding, guess what? They remain poor, and this means that they remain stuck in the cycle of having poor democratic institutions. And the cycle just goes on and on and on because having poor democratic institutions and a lack of transparency means you're never eligible for funding from the World Bank. But this is we also win on scale, right? Because this applies to all the developing countries worldwide who already don't have the current capacity to become more transparent at its current state. And the only way to do that is to give them time. For all those reasons,
Thank you very much, O, for those very fine speeches, calling upon the closing half, which is the member of parliament. Yeah.
All right, and we're both audible and visible.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Pronouns she, her. I prefer verbal POIs, and if everyone's ready, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2. The reason why opposition bench loses debate is simple. It's because they fail to recognize that the money is not the most important thing when it comes to developing countries. The people cannot be a means to an end, especially because the only reason why we care about economic development is so that we are able to adhere to the people on the ground. Very proud to propose. I'm going to forward you a few responses before I give you our 2 extensions. Firstly, on why the off-bench alternative is far likely to be worse, considering the interests of international bodies are symmetric. But secondly, how we better protect those on the ground. Firstly, though, a few responses. I think there are a few lines of logic that come from opposition bench. The first idea is that corrupt leaders do not necessarily want to reveal their own corruption, which is why they're unlikely to opt into this. 2 levels of response. First, I think it's reasonable to think that this organization is pretty rational in the types of requirements that they have. We don't need people to snitch on each other. At most, it's usually going to be transparency going forward. For instance, what kind of contract you make with what companies, or what exactly are the requirements, or what differences are you making to make sure that or the transfer of funds between the government and these private corporations is something that is actually overseen. I'll take you a bit later. So we see that even if it's simply the changes that are going forward or transparency that's demanded in the future, that's already a very significant change that we're making because that's something they inherently fundamentally don't require. But second, if the type of corruption in these nations is so deep-rooted that even transparency has the chance to harm the very core stability, we're going to tell you that these nations are simply not the main focus of this debate. We're far more willing to trade them off because there's going to be a marginal difference even if these nations exist in opposition's world, insofar as corruption is always going to be their main incentive. That leads me to my second line of response then, because they try to tell you, try to posit, the nations are incentivized to do well naturally anyway, even in their world. 3 levels of response. First, especially when opening opposition concedes that corruption exists, they cannot defend efficacy anymore. Often, unstable economies that make people rely on the leader is beneficial for corrupt governments and corrupt regimes. It is untrue that mass economic development is always going to be the main incentive of these politicians. Insofar as the economy itself is weak, and I am able to be in a position of power that makes it far easier for me to continue to corrupt funds or weasel them in a way that is far more beneficial for me, insofar as people cannot hold me accountable when the economy or when society in general is unstable. We've already seen this trend throughout history. But second, if it's true that nations are incentivized to do well naturally, that's furthermore why it's not a problem even in our world that they would be far more willing to open it up or be more transparent. And I think this is where it's untrue that when opposition tells it's systemically harder to be transparent as a small nation a bit later. On the other hand, we actually think that it's a lower barrier in admitting issues or admitting that you have political or corruption issues as a smaller developing nation because there's less damage to FDI or image when people already expect you to be unstable to a certain extent compared to larger nations in which people expect you to be a lot more stabilized. But last, Also, they never explain to you the propensity analysis on why the transition to democracy is something that is likely to happen in their world. Rather, we tell you that it's the opposite, that over time, the solidification of such ideas is far more likely to happen as there's so much economic development. Before I go on, I'll take a POI. POI.
If I'm the president of Zimbabwe and I need to become transparent and admit to my wrongdoings, why would I do this if it means I'm going to be kicked out and I'll lose power, which is against my most proximate interest?
You don't have to. I don't think that the World Bank is so dumb as to require the president to snitch on himself for his past wrongdoings. Clearly, what is far more likely is that they say, from the point in which we give you these funds, you need to report to us directly and give us the receipts or give us the transaction notices of exactly what you did with these funds. And we think this is far more likely the type of political transparency that is likely to take place, when they say that from now on, your elections must be far more transparent. You must report to us exactly the election processes look like. We don't think that they're likely to dwell on the past insofar as they know why it's important that they get nations to opt in anyway. 2 levels of extension then. Firstly, on why opposition alternative is worse. And here I want to point out, no thank you, the OG fails to engage on this side of this debate. The premise here is very simple, that the incentive of international banks are symmetric in opposition's world as well, which is to ensure transparency and efficacy in economies of developing nations, because they want to ensure that they're able to get this money paid back to them. Note that then, Judge, the propensity analysis is that without the type of political methods, such as in our political transparency, it's likely that these international banks instead look like doubling down on conditions for forcibly opening up markets or removing protectionist policies, because that's what their world grants a similar relief or guarantee for these international banks in being able to have the transparency over their market. Why is this far worse? 2 reasons. First, it's a forcible transition of the economy, which hits people on the ground far harder than forcible transition of making sure that you have more transparent elections, for instance, which doesn't have as much of a direct impact. Plus, the second, removal of protectionist policies, especially when you're already resource extracting, puts your economy in a very vulnerable state, because obviously, as a developing nation, you're probably not in a state to compete. Then, the harms that O gives you on the reason why it's hard to access, or the reason why nations don't opt into these policies, is far worse than, because on their world, these conditions are likely to be different. Secondly, though, how do we protect those on the ground? 2 independent mechanisms. Firstly, on corruption. I think OG doesn't flesh out, especially on corruption, enough. No, thank you. We tell you that corruption is absolutely the worst case scenario. Just like the Philippines and the 1MDB scandal, where even if you have a lot of money, it was never spent on the public, never spent in an efficient way, because the system itself was able to be so corrupt. Instead, it went on like Imelda Marcos's shoes. And the reason why corruption is so dangerous is because even though they had the entire dictatorship scandal, his son, Bongbong Marcos, was voted again for president. Clearly, the moment in which corruption becomes deep-rooted is something that is very hard to remove. They trade off people's lives during that window, even if they get the transition in the long run. We don't know why that's something that is meaningful. But second, we gain other types of international cooperation and human rights far better. We tell you that the exploitation and lack of interest for human rights or modern day slavery is far more emancipated in their world, insofar as the government doesn't have a reason to care about it as long as it speeds economic development. We don't think that's a precedent that the international community wants to set, especially when you're able to turn these nations towards a more democratic way, or at least push them to be more political transparent. We get 2 impacts. Firstly, that we have better protection for people on the ground, but secondly, that the international community is also more likely to work with you, or at least be more willing to invest in you, especially if you don't have major leverage as a developing nation because of like the natural resources that you have. You need to politically align yourself with the larger nations, for instance, with the Western nations, to be able to get the meaningful FDI that they want. The weighing here is simple, that people's lives cannot be a means to an end, and economy only matters because we protect people's lives. So when they tell you that the only funds matter in the short term, we know that this is simply not true. They need to be then principally willing to defend things like opting into China's BRI program. Except the reason why we intuitively don't want that is because clearly we recognize that it's not strategic and it harms people in the long run. Very proud to propose.
Thank you so much, MG, for that very fine speech calling upon Emma for beginning the CO's case. Go ahead.
Right. Can I be heard if I speak like this?
Yes, you are.
Yes, we do. POIs in the chat. I'll take one from OG. Countries like Malaysia, Sudan, and Kenya are resource rich but lack the capital to effectively extract it and utilize it well. As a huge source of economic revenue, states will look for ways to finance resource extraction through resource collateralized loan, which is what we're debating about today. So the question in this debate is not whether or not nations will take loans from the MDB, is where these nations will get their funding from. And the OG's characterization that MDBs care more about development show that they are the better choice in this debate. And the alternatives are much worse. The problem is if you put these restrictions and conditions upon the loan that is required to do resource extraction, you push this developing nation to other sources of funding that is much less dangerous, charge much higher interest, and overall makes things much, much worse. We will then go to show that in the best case where you can demand transparency, we will show it jeopardizes political stability and the economic development that requires it. These two extensions will bring us to win, or bring us straight after, give us the win. First, extension. We will examine the counterfactual. Where will these nations be getting resource collateralized loan? We think that in the absence of getting this money from MDB, these nations are likely to get this from two sources. The first is from private commercial loans. These tend to be profit-oriented and will charge high interest, and the shareholders tend to have less interest to sympathize with governments that default on debt. So if the states don't manage to repay the loan, then they're going to get squeezed later on. I think OG themselves recognizes this. But in the absence of MDBs, are likely to turn to this because it's better to pay higher interest than to report on your corruption. The second option, I think the far worse option here, is that these countries are much more likely to turn to financing from China. This can be direct loans either directly from China or can be through Chinese-funded institutions like the New Development Bank under BRICS, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank that's hugely funded by China, etc. And the huge incentive to do this, right? The transparency requirements that are required in OG are often difficult to comply with. By OG's own analysis, opposition parties will slander them with accusations of corruption, which is why they won't opt in the first place. These reporting mechanisms may not exist, and the self-reporting mechanism that OG accepts is probably going to happen is very extremely unreliable. And things like corruption and cronyism exist. So when it does happen, there's a direct incentive for these nations to hide it themselves. I think all points to this analysis already. But you have to weigh this up against the incentive report, because the CG says that, this mechanism is not going to be so punitive. Maybe it's okay to admit you are a little bit corrupt. The problem is that this is not true. No, your opposition parties in these countries will eat you alive if you even accept that there's some degree of corruption happening. You're necessarily going to lose the support of your voters and your voter base because they know they have hard evidence that you are corrupt. Even if that's not the case, international bodies have a moral imperative to act right now because you have admitted that you are corrupt. So if previously you have this sterling record of whatever corruption index you had, now that you've admitted that you are corrupt, now international bodies say we cannot lend to corrupt regimes. We're not sure where this money is going, and that makes it a lot harder for this nation to do anything, which is a huge incentive for them not to report this in the first place. Examples is that Israel is not saying that Gaza is the genocide. That's why the international community cannot act. The moment Israel accepts that to be the case, there's a moral imperative for other countries to step into this country and make sure that things are not happening. What it shows basically is that the incentive to report is just very, very, very low, especially when cases of corruption are there. And you have to compare this. On one hand, you maybe can get a little bit better loans if you have to report your corruption. On the other hand, you can get the exact same kind of financing without this reporting, without the reporting requirements. There's a very clear incentive from the perspective of the leader to go for these more predatory loans from their perspective to secure economic development for their country. So they're more likely to turn to Chinese funding. And we also say that China has a huge incentive to do this because they want to spread their geopolitical influence in direct contention to Western hegemonies like the US, UK, and France, etc. They want to spread things like soft power by offering loans, but also in cases for particularly poor nations, they use debt trap diplomacy to trap them. For example, in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port was given to China for 999 years because they defaulted on the loan, which happened because President Rajapaksa was defeated in the 2015 election by the other guy, who U-turned completely and promised to shield Sri Lanka and stop all works on Chinese projects. This shows that China is willing to use debt trap diplomacy as a mechanism to control the countries under the region, especially in the South and Southeast Asia region, in order to spread the influence. Also happened in Pakistan. They took a $1 million loan from China to pay back a $1 million loan from the IMF because they thought that the terms that China offered was better. The impact on this is twofold. One, this is worse for weaker nations to have Chinese influence over your governance, to have Chinese companies flood your market, have Chinese immigrants coming to the country, and having your foreign policy dictated by China. China is likely to want to seek control for the incentives I pointed out earlier, so they're likely to pressure states to continue shutting down democratic processes like social movements in order to retain control over this government, which is worse for political transparency, which is what the government bench wants in this debate, which is what the people need in this world today. On a comparative, without these rules, these nations are free to take loans from multinational banks like the World Bank, like the IMF, that do not come with these negative implications. But even if they don't take money from the MDB, the existence of the MDB as an option creates competitive pressure on Chinese funded institutions, so they cannot attach these kinds of rules. If not, nations in Asia and Africa will just go elsewhere. This is much better for those nations as well. The comparative in this debate is nations will turn to worse sources of funding. That's much worse for everyone. That's enough for us to win the debate. Before I go on, I'll take OG.
Opting into obviously worse loans like the NDB opens you up to the same opposition slander. It's not hard to prove where all transactions went by just giving World Bank access to where their money goes. Only OG prevents the harms of every instance of corruption, and only OG keeps Western countries happy enough to keep paying into institutions like the World Bank.
Yeah. So the opposition parties can throw a lot of things at you. The thing here is that if you report your corruption, if people find out about it and there's hard evidence that you are corrupt, the opposition parties will absolutely murder you. That is the difference, and that's the chance that these countries don't want to take. Second argument, why political stability is necessary for the economic stability necessary to develop the nation. Malaysia's greatest development phase came under the leadership of our fourth Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad. We had a world-class international airport, convention center, digital corridor, etc. But this came at the direct cost of political transparency through the ISA that shut down dissent, arresting activists and opposition leaders. This is not great, but we argue that in these developing nations that are still nascent democracies, some degree of cronyism is necessary for economic development. On this scale, our own national government corporation, Petronas, grew exponentially throughout the Asian financial crisis. And this is true because resource extraction requires a long period of time. There's very heavy upfront infrastructure development. You require a stable economic climate for investors to be sure they can reap returns on the investment later on. Economic development is good for people on the ground that often suffer from a lack of education and other potential jobs. If nations don't do this because they can't get loans, people on the ground lose out. The transparency mechanism that the government wants often creates instability in their best case through elections, through media callouts. Sometimes leaders need to be nepotistic to pass political deals. Sometimes they face pressure from the power brokers in their own country. Our own Prime Minister Anwar teamed up with UMNO, historically corrupt party, to create a government. So the best case of open government, where this transparency mechanism work and they do function, they create a degree of political instability that threatens economic security, that pushes investors away and make it less likely for the development to happen and the people on the ground to benefit from that development. Much, much worse. So happy to oppose.
Thank you so much, Emma, for the good fun speech following upon the government whip to end the side of the CG. Yeah. I hope I was audible. Calling upon
Sorry, I think my
CG.
volume's not working. Give me a sec. Hi,
Yeah,
am
you
I
are
visible or
audible.
not? Oh, okay, thank you. POIs verbally, please, not through the chat. And my time starts in 3, 2, 1. So the main metric we want to pursue in our extension is what's least destructive for people on the ground, as well as the longevity of the state. Two things that the opposing sides, both OO and CO, simply cannot offer. Because what we do is we remove three things. First of all, one party taking over the entire government system, which would be the most viable scenario, considering how they talk about, oh, like even without political transparency, we can pursue economic development. In that case, we'd rather have a benevolent dictator than trying to have all these other different systems. So we believe that we actually prevent this, which leads to a whole load of a whole can of worms of other issues, which we're going to expand on later. Secondly, we also remove blatant violations of human rights that are ongoing within the status quo. We completely remove that as well. And thirdly and lastly, we also prevent protectionist policies, which further isolate people from free trade and all these other things, which we believe will actually occur worse on their side. And opposition only really mitigates this by saying two things. First, saying oh, maybe have economic growth through investment, which was on side OO, as well as saying that, oh, these countries have a lot of natural resources and they need to be able to use these coming from closing opposition. And they basically say, oh, we have a lot of short-term economic growth, we'll be able to make this work, blah, 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 blah. However, we think that this ultimately does not remove all these three reasons that we just talked about, nor does it actively address how we are the ones that actually protect the vulnerable populations, how we are the ones to also protect the longevity of the state, which Jan has already talked about throughout her entire speech. And we also think that there's just a lot of contradictions coming from both cases to opposition, especially on the CO side, which we'll address later, especially considering how they claim that, oh, well, for like these like other countries can always like turn to China and other alternatives if we add the stipulation. We think that if that is the case, then like people like countries will always turn to China then. If like what they offer is so good and what they bring to the table is so much better, then they're obviously always going to turn to China regardless of whether this stipulation of political transparency is offered or not, if they believe that China or like other such states can offer such better alternatives. So also just to clarify before like I begin this debate, there's just been a lot of comments coming from opposition on how like state officials, they'll have to like there's always the fear, like if they publicize their lack of political transparency, they're gonna be chased out, whatever, then it's apparent that the corruption hasn't really worked, right? Like it's clear that their like position hasn't been solidified enough for them to be chased out easily. So we think that on their side, that's like just like a really like cheap, just like an easy way of like of lying, claiming that like this harm doesn't exist on their side. We still think that most of the countries that we're dealing with is where corruption has become so prevalent that it's extremely difficult to tackle this. And like a lot of times there's a certain monopoly by a state official. However, we think that just claiming that, oh, well, like opposing parties can chase them out, that's not really the definition of prevalent corruption, is it? So moving on directly to like what really differentiates our extension from like the rest from like this case coming from OG. But before that, I'll take a POI if there are any.
Yeah, so even if the IMF lowers its transparency need, which knifes your OG model, doesn't that just mean that your impact is lower because corrupt leaders still stay in power? And like it also means that nations who don't need this funding get the funding, and nations who can't transition don't get the funding.
Sorry, can you just repeat the POI again?
Yeah, even if the transparency need is lower, doesn't that still mean that like corrupt leaders still stay in power and nations who can transition will get the funding, whereas nations who need it the most can't get the funding?
Okay, but like the problem is, under your side, if that's the case, if like they're so unwilling to like actively try to enact like public political transparency and stuff, then they're always going to turn to China anyway. They're not going to like turn towards the IMF and other such organizations where they're going to actually better like the current status quo. We think that's just a very radical case coming from your stance. And we can also easily argue that, oh, under our side, the best case scenario is all these countries will magically want to turn to the IMF. We're not arguing that, so just stop trying to use like extremely radical cases under your side of like all these countries like suddenly like not wanting to engage in political transparency just because the IMF adds another stipulation to the very long list of regulations they already have on how countries are supposed to act, austerity measures, and etc. So moving on directly to what differentiates our extension, right? So we do agree that the metric is like the ability to protect developing countries' population. So we also add the longevity of the state as well, right? Where we say that, oh, things like corruption, things like all these, just like relying just on short-term economic growth simply based on like utilizing natural resources and exploiting them without like the promise of political transparency simply isn't going to work. And we also think that most of OG's case hinges on the principle of short-term and long-term, right? And that's what most of it hinges on. And the like kind of practical impact is like lofty goals, like ending extreme poverty and things like that, right? However, under our side, we have clearly written alternatives and like mechanisms, and where we have to align, and where under our side, like these specific states will need to align themselves with specific universal values, all the way from having to prevent modern day slavery and extrajudicial killings up to homophobia and all these like sort of homophobic sort of legislations are going on in the status quo. And we also think regarding entire justification of buy-in, right? OG continuously gives like radical examples of like how OG's like keeps on giving like radical examples of like, you know, how like we're going to have like public buy-in and etc. of like regardless of this, and like how like public political transparency will happen instead. We don't think we need to necessarily defend that, because we believe that if these countries are so unwilling to like actively, you know, like engage in political transparency, they won't anyway under like both worlds, because that's like a mutual harm we have. So moving on directly to like both like most of what opening opposition and CO comes out, right? Because like the kind of premises are kind of overlap in the middle. So first of all, just to clarify, under characterization of public officials and buying in, right? They claim that, oh, you know, like these public officials will try to channel their funds into better sources in order to prove to the public that they're not corrupt. So they're going to have like all these like economic development regardless. We still think that's a very radical definition, and it's like mutual harm on both sides, because it's already happening in the status quo, right? So that even if this is the case, like we still believe that IGOs are better suited in order to like actively like improve the current situation, because they have expert analysts, they have all these experts that are actively trying to come up with better issues. Now moving on directly to what the overall premise of like opposition side is, right? They claim that lack of transparency isn't like really necessary for the well-being of the country due to two aspects. First of all, economic growth, and secondly, overall democracy. For economic growth, again, first of all, they keep using the assumption of like, oh, there's going to be more FDI. However, we think that this is a trade-off you need to take, right? Because if there's nepotism and bribery, and they're not going to be appointed to look well in the eyes of the public, if you don't have like a political transparency already, what's most likely going to happen is even if you have like uprisings, even if you have people that are like a natural result of democracy, they're not going to be easily toppled in the first place, and they'll be able to maintain their political position regardless, as there's no population awareness, there's no mechanisms or checks and balances in place. Secondly, we think that regardless of what happens, and what we actually prevent is the distribution of wealth going towards elites, which is the thing that happens in opposition, right? Even if there's FDI and stuff, this is only something that will affect a few companies that are favored in the eyes of the government. So what does this look like for people on the ground? It looks like hard labor. It looks like lack of human rights being actually protected. For instance, Colombia are having like loans amounting like $2 billion, but in order to like, but they're very borrowed this from other countries, but they're still unable to protect rural populations, and they don't receive any sort of investments, right? And moving on to like overall democracy, right? There's like three specific reasons why their entire argument of how democracy will happen organically does not work. First of all, practices solidify just how habits are hard to actively get rid of. And in the best case scenario, there's just going to be organized riots. So even with Arab Springs, where it's cited as the most successful example of like uprisings, countries like Egypt and Libya are still suffering, and even worse situation with corruption and bribery still occurring. There's already instances where organic change is already difficult. And we just think that the entire characterization of benevolent dictator doesn't work. Secondly, corrupt officials, again, as you mentioned, are extremely hard to get rid of. And thirdly and lastly, we believe that economic growth is not sustainable. So we already think that as we proved so far, the limitations on both sides is that you're unable to really like actually promise economic growth. You're unable to actually have organic democracy taking place compared to what we give you an actually clear alternative world where we have specific mechanisms, and we acknowledge the mutual harm that occurs on both sides. And for those reasons, we are very proud to
Thank you so much, Web, for the refined speech, calling upon the opposition Web to begin their sort of share.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, okay, good. The reason China was the debate-winning extension is that a lot of Gov's benefits are premised on the idea that countries have no possible alternative. In fact, if you listen to the OG's case, most of their speeches explain the benefits of transparency. That is not the contention in this debate, right? We are questioning the implementation. So O is right when they point out that they can be transparent, but they won't be transparent. I'm going to do three things in this speech. Number one, I'm going to destroy this premise that we have no alternative. Secondly, I tell you, even if China is invisible and not a factor in this debate, why we still win. Lastly, I'll tell you how CG destroys people on the ground, flipping their extension, and why they are a hard fall for me. One, let's talk about Gov's premise, which I think mainly is OG's problem, but CG as well. They jumped to the conclusion that their mechanism will work. Our extension gave you multiple reasons why China is a not so preferable alternative. What did we hear in response? We had a very feeble one-liner that, oh, these countries will turn to China anyway. What? They don't want to give up the damn port or the damn mine, guys. Our argument was they will trade off the harms of debt trap diplomacy. They will trade off the higher interest rate for access to money. Because the comparative is a 1% higher interest rate from China, maybe a 2% from a commercial bank, versus no money at all. So they will turn to China in that respect. Incidentally, this is why we also outweigh OO. In multiple POIs, they point out that people don't have an incentive to rat themselves out. The CO extension is that it is easier for them to turn to someone in the region who already has a incentive to give them money. We gave you examples of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, and all of these other, like, I think it's quite intuitive, and most people would know that China is expanding geopolitical influence in the African region, so they would turn to China. So that's why a lot of their benefits fall through. But two, let's take them at their absolute best and say China is not a factor in this debate. Then our second extension comes in, and it's genius. In response to FDIs, by the way, I think Gov has a very simplistic idea that transparency equals the only metric I would invest in something. That's not true, right? OO says sometimes these countries need to be non-transparent because of armies, wars and stuff. We gave you better analysis. We said that things like a stable economic climate. We gave you the example of Sri Lanka when politicians U-turn and want to suddenly engage in nationalism. They stop work on Chinese projects. The damn HSR, which is a bridge between Malaysia and Singapore, has been delayed indefinitely because every time the political party changes, they decide, do I want to build a bridge? Do I not want to build a bridge? And Singapore is left hanging. Like, that's an example of why these things take time. We gave you analysis that building infrastructure takes time. It's not a lump sum payment, it's a progress payment. At each stage of completion, you pay a bit more. So it is important with a stable economic climate to have investors come in. And this kind of flips Gulf's analysis of FDIs, right? Because political instability is the very deterrent on investors. That's why lots of people pull out of the markets when the government changes. For example, the US elections is coming up. You'll see the stock market tank every time the US political party changes because people fear instability. So even if China is invisible and this country, these leaders are stupid enough to disclose that, hey man, I'm a human rights abuser, I took all this money for myself, and the government changes, that's bad because FDIs will not want to come into a country which is filled with economic uncertainty. We think they don't have any benefits under their side of the house. Thirdly, on democracy, I think Elo gives you some good arguments on globalization and why the trend moves towards that in the long term. To be very fair, on the op, this is not even our burden. Like, we don't have to prove that we move towards democracy. We just did it because we're very charitable. But let's talk about democracy if they want to. Let's ignore OO because I'm obviously trying to be different. Democracy is often viewed as a Western ideal at the point in which you withhold funding and the monetary problems of people on the ground are directly attributed to the West. People are less likely to opt into democracy. They are more likely to turn to China and align themselves politically with China. 2, let's take out CG. I'll take you guys in a bit. Their main problem is that we use people as an end. And I think that's a very interesting argument. They try to cop out this debate. They say, oh, you don't have to disclose that you were corrupt in the past. You just have to disclose from this point forward. Okay, interesting argument. What is the weighing on this? We said that 500 million African people are currently employed in this project. These people are poor, they have no education, they have no transferable skills. You screw them over when you cut off the funding. These are people on the ground who don't have an alternative to turn to. These are people who derive income. So while the time gap argument is interesting, the way you would weigh this is that you necessarily put people out of jobs like now in comparison to the future where you have to believe in some abstract harm of corruption. I'll take OG.
At the point where it's extremely well known that China only offers predatory loans, no reasonable politician is willing to accept them on either side of the house, especially if the only condition to giving the World Bank access to your transactions and contractor info. If they accept Chinese loans, it's even more of a political suicide than straight up admitting to your own corruption.
No, that's untrue for 2 reasons. The first is that people want money. Like I said, the comparative is between a 1% higher interest and no money. But the second extension is that if you rat yourself out, like Gulf so idealistic claims, dude, you lose all your money. So you literally have no money compared to China. The reason, if you believe that politicians are so corrupt, most of the time the loans that come in, the money goes to them and not to the people, so they aren't really concerned about paying it off, insofar as they can still line their pockets from China. So that's the comparative. I think you guys lose out. Let's talk about extension and why we think was absolutely amazing. So the first thing we said was that China is necessarily the alternative. We gave you good examples of them reclaiming natural resources and extracting it from themselves. So that's why that's the comparative. Are you likely to believe that someone will rat themselves out and change something which has a direct impact on my pockets, or will I just move to buddy up with a closer ally in the region? We say, and we posit on CO, that most African countries are moving towards China simply because China literally has an incentive to extract the resources. China has an incentive to build infrastructure due to the Belt and Road Initiative. That doesn't happen under Gulf. So even if China was invisible, we said that we are better for FDI because we provide political stability, which is better for continuity and economic policy. And lastly, even if you don't buy any of this and we just engage with CG, we think you use people as a means to an end, because if you take away the corruption, these people are left without a job. Insofar as you need to weigh this, is transparency worth the amount of 500 million African people now not having a job, not having a livelihood? We think we're not okay with making that sacrifice. Very proud to propose on CO.
Thank you so much, everyone, for those very fine speeches. As you guys know, that it was an out round, meaning that there wouldn't be any particular OA. So all the speakers